welcome. I'm Gloria Quadio. This is the Caritas Consciousness Project, and we are broadcasting to you this evening from Tucson, Arizona, which is where Dr. Claude Swanson lives, and I am hosting from here in Colorado. As our new name implies, our Caritas Consciousness Project, our purpose is to promote the evolution of consciousness individually and collectively. Caritas is a forum for consciousness studies involving paranormal faculties, healing, spiritual exploration, and the convergence of science and spirituality. We are a nonprofit, 501c3. We do rely heavily on memberships. So I encourage you, whether this is your first time or whether you've been enjoying our programs for a while, please consider becoming a member, which you can do on our website, which is caritascenter.org. Okay, the URL has remained the same. The memberships start at $10 a month. There is no upper limit, but we do encourage you, and it is tax deductible. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. Okay, so this evening we're delighted to have Dr. Claude Swanson online with us once again in this fifth lecture in his series on his new book, Science of the Soul, the Afterlife and The Shift. And tonight's presentation is on mediums and mediumship. So for those of you who are attending for the first time this series, I will say a few words about Dr. Swanson. He was educated as a physicist at MIT and Princeton University for more than 25 years, interspersed with his conventional professional career in applied physics. Dr. Swanson has pursued investigations into unconventional physics. His principal interest has been the unified field theory, the so-called theory of everything, which could explain the universe at the deepest possible level. This has led him to investigate many aspects of the paranormal, which appear to be completely real phenomena that violate our present science. Paranormal phenomena which have now been proven in the laboratory in many cases and offer a window into the deeper universe, the mysteries of consciousness, and unlock new forces and principles which conventional science has only begun to glimpse. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Claude Swanson. And there he is. Okay.
Hi, Gloria. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Let's see. I'm just going to continue in going over some of the things in the book, and this is the chapter on mediums and mediumship. And of course, there are people here, including Gloria, who knows a lot more about mediums than I do. But at least I can study them as a scientist and try to figure out how our science can begin to understand. Mediums are a really important way to make contact with the afterlife, with the spirit world. So this is lecture 5 on mediums. And one of the things that I discovered from the research on this book is how many different kinds of mediums there are, different kinds of mediumship. We make contact with the afterlife in many different ways, so that we can learn different things from those different methods of accessing the afterlife. Whoever did the software on this system, I don't know. I'd like to talk to them sometime. So that's my background. Everyone here knows that my training was as a conventional physicist, but ever since the 80s, I've been interested in remote viewing and all the other consciousness phenomena that tell us that we are much more than our physical bodies. There's much more to the universe than matter. And as we study things like ESP and psychic phenomena and the afterlife and spirit phenomena, we learn more about what else there is out there, what the higher dimensions are like, and sort of the larger dimensions of who we really are as beings. And what I sort of learned from my research is that our soul is really much more important to who we are than the physical body. We're all used to looking at the physical bodies here on the earth and thinking that's it. But really, it lives a finite amount of time, while the soul, the essence of who we are, lives basically forever and has a lot of interesting properties that you can learn as you study the afterlife. Um, my books, there's 3 books right now. Volumes 1, which is The Synchronized Universe. My first book talks about various remarkable phenomena that happen and the evidence for it and how we can modify our physics to explain it. Volume 2 is called Life Force, and that talks about the special energy torsion or chi that has been left out of Western physics. When you include that, you can suddenly begin to explain certain things that right now Western materialistic science can't explain. Qigong masters can bend laser beams 1,000 miles away. They can stop radioactive decay. They can do all kinds of things that our Western science can't explain because there's a force that has been left out of our Western physics. And Volume 2 talks about this special energy. The Russians call it torsion. They have developed a science for it. And I find that it is key to understanding the afterlife. That when our physical bodies die and are buried or cremated, there's something that survives. And that's something we can talk about as this torsion energy, which carries patterns with it and intelligence. And that makes up the soul. That's the key to who we are. So volume 3 is The Science of the Soul. That's my present book that pulls all this together in a picture and tries to connect the science with what we know from all kinds of different spirit phenomena. As George Meek, the great explorer of the afterlife, said, in the last 25 years, mankind has learned more about what happens when we die than was learned in all earlier periods of recorded history. So we're right now in a period of rapid expansion where our knowledge and understanding of the afterlife and of the higher dimensions. And this also goes to higher consciousness. When we meditate and achieve a higher level of consciousness, when we can reach a knowledge of other phenomena happening on the higher planes, we are reaching these same levels of consciousness that are reached in the afterlife. So there's a connection between higher consciousness and the afterlife. And then there are a bunch of different ways of learning about the afterlife. Obviously, from our present Western science, we think we don't have any way to measure what goes on there, but there are a number of different effects and phenomena that we've discovered that do give us information about what goes on. I've mentioned these before. These are the basic topics that are in my book: near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, electronic voice phenomena, where spirits actually create signals that are recorded on electrical tape recorders or other types of electronics, past life regressions, mediumship, which is today's topic, childhood memories of past lives, which tell us that we have a connection to physical existences on this earth or sometimes in other places. And when we're little, we often can remember those things. Then once we begin to talk and go to school and get acclimatized to our Western environment, we quickly forget, so that by age 6 or so, we tend to have forgotten a lot of our memories of those past lives. But with hypnosis, we can still recover those. Automatic writing is another way that people use. Mediums go into a trance state and allow spirits to use the muscles in their arm to move the pen and write messages. Of course, we have adepts and masters who are capable of going into those states of higher consciousness at any time and can travel among them. And most recently, places like the Monroe Institute have taught other people, ordinary folks like you and me, to go out of body to achieve what they call a higher focus level, where we can go to the same afterlife planes and visit other spirits who are there, even preparing a place for ourselves when we go there. They have various programs in which they do that. And people like Bruce Moen have written several books about his explorations there. So it's another view, another window into the afterlife from a different direction. We have messages that come from dreams and visions in which our loved ones often speak to us. And of course, spirit possession is another way that we know that spirits are real. When someone gets taken over by a soul or a spirit of somebody else, and suddenly their identity changes, their actions change, their interests change, even sometimes their voice and their eye color changes. Multiple personalities are one example of this, and these are caused by the presence of spirits. But there are ways of dealing with that and correcting for it. But it's first necessary to recognize that it's possible. Western science, unfortunately, because of its materialistic attitude, tends to discount the possibility that this can occur. There are scientists, as I discuss in my book, who have considered this from a realistic perspective and have been able to cure people very rapidly by recognizing that spirit possession is possible. Of course, there are ghosts, hauntings, poltergeists, there are sacred texts, and many other sources like this that all tell us different pieces of what the afterlife is like. Tonight, what we're going to talk about is one of the ones that's most popular and best known to most Americans, mediums. There was a very popular TV show about a medium named Alison Dubois, who lives in Phoenix, and very, very, very capable. She used what's called telepathic mediumship, which means that in her head, she could hear the voices of the spirits when they talk. She could talk back to them, and she had a pretty good, sometimes she could see them. She had a pretty good idea what was going on from her telepathic mediumship. And that's the most common form of mediumship that most people have encountered. But there are a variety of other methods as well by which we can learn about the spirit world. So here's a list besides telepathic. There's automatic writing, where the spirit takes over your hand and moves the pen and writes. And we'll talk about some great famous mediums who could do this. There are physical mediums who generate a special energy that is halfway between the spirit world and the physical world. It acts as an intermediary material. It's called ectoplasm. It's been viewed skeptically for dozens of years by many Western scientists. I used to be very skeptical about it. It seems that back in the teens and 20s of the 20th century, there were a number of famous fraud cases because typically these experiments were done in the dark, and people could cheat and slip in some muslin cloth or a drawing or something else and try to pawn it off as being genuine. And because things were in the dark, they were often caught later. And so a lot of skepticism grew up around physical mediums. In recent years, with the advent of very low light photography, using infrared cameras and very low light very low light intensity cameras. We can now take pictures in dark conditions when a physical medium is operating. And we've been able to prove that ectoplasm is very real and that these phenomena, which are really strange and very curious, are quite real, and they show the interaction between the spirit world and the physical world, and they give us tangible results so we can photograph, we can preserve, we can touch to prove that the afterlife is something very genuine. And then direct voice is one more method where spirits can use this special material, ectoplasm, to generate what they call a voice box. It's a voice box, it's an adapter between the medium's vocal cords and the spirit world. And the spirits speak into this box, and the sound comes out in the room someplace, and they can communicate their own thoughts in their own languages. They will know things the medium doesn't know. They may have a totally different language. The sound comes out in their voice quality, their age, all these properties that, of course, a skeptic would say, well, he's just a ventriloquist, or he's a skilled imitator. And there's been lots and lots of research done to prove that this is it's a genuine form of mediumship. And we have a lot of good information, because when the spirits communicate directly in real time about what their life is like in the afterlife, it gives a lot of valuable insight into the conditions over there. So telepathic mediums are the first of those categories. We know John Edward, of course, he had a TV show. Alison Dubois on Medium. They use telepathy, and they will then tell us what they're hearing, and we have to believe them. We have to believe that they're sincere or not. And of course, that's where skeptics can have a field day, because you can always, if they're not very precise and very exact, you can always draw questions about what they're doing. There are some people who've used what's called cold reading. They'll try to lead on the person they're reading and sort of guess the answer and use tricks like that to act like they're mind reading when they're not really doing so. But in recent years, techniques have been developed to use where the medium is put in a closed container, where he has no ability to do that kind of questioning of anybody else, and he just gives whatever information he's receiving directly, and then they score him on the quality of the information and the accuracy of the information. So the advantage of this kind of mediumship is that it's more common. There are more people who have this ability in our society, so we're more likely to find people who do have this talent. The disadvantage is you don't have the tangible proof. It's more subject to fraud and misinterpretation. This is Gary Schwartz is one person who, and there are other organizations. Forever Family Foundation is another one that I've been president of years ago, that works with the afterlife and with departed loved ones. And they will take mediums, or would-be mediums, and put them through a series of tests just like this, where they're in a closed container and they can't see anybody or talk to anybody directly. They have to just describe information, what they see, what they hear, and then they will score them on that, and the accuracy from that will then determine whether they're really getting the information through paranormal means, or is there some trickery involved. This is just one sample from Gary Schwartz's work, where he took 4 well-known mediums, medium 1, medium 2, medium 3, and medium 4. I think Alison Dubois was one of these. And then you can see the control score in the middle. It's about 40 or so, but the mediums all scored around 80. So their accuracy was much higher than random chance. So it shows that it does work. And this is a nice little example of the kind of quality you get from a really good medium. Albert Best was a famous telepathic medium, and the story is told about him. There was a minister in the Church of Scotland, Reverend David Kennedy, whose wife Anne had died young, and the minister was deeply bereaved. One day he cried out to the empty room, "Come on, Anne, give me a sign, something no one could possibly know." And then he fell asleep on the sofa, very sad and worrying about the sermon he had to prepare for his service later on in the day. He suddenly woke up and realized he'd overslept. He had only 5 minutes to prepare his sermon and find his minister's collar. Frantically, he searched the house and could not find his old notes or a clean collar. And I can relate to this feeling. Anyway, excuse me. So at that moment, the phone started ringing, but he was too rushed to answer it. It continued to ring and ring. At length, he picked up the receiver and said angrily, "Can I help you?" The voice on the other end of the phone said, "Your wife, Anne, is with me. She tells me that your clean collars are in the bottom drawer of your wardrobe, and the speech you prepared last year for this service is in the top drawer of your desk. Incidentally, my name is Albert Best. Goodbye." And all the information was correct. And it goes on that so the minister discovered that he could communicate with his wife quite easily by just speaking into the empty room, and then she would communicate with Best and give the answer. But he became so dependent on that eventually Best called him up and said, "Would you please tell your wife to stop bugging me?" So anyway, but it shows that for really good telepathic mediums, the communication can be very accurate. Another high-quality medium was Margaret Flavel. She worked with Air Marshal Lord Dowding in the Battle of Britain in World War II, when there were flyers being shot down in England. And the Air Marshal needed help in finding the flyers, either recovering them if they were injured or if they were dead, finding their bodies. And she, as a medium, was able to make contact with the flyers and was successful at finding and recovering those young men. And because of her record, she was quite well known to be very accurate. And she became selected by the family of A.D. Matson, who was a well-known preacher or religious man and a theologian. When he was close to death, he made contact with her, and they arranged that when he died, he'd be able to talk to her after death and report back on what he was going through. And the experiment was much better than they ever expected. She ended up writing 500 pages about his communications. It became a classic book called Witness from Beyond. It's a beautiful book in which you can get a very vivid idea of what the afterlife is like. He describes what he goes through each day, his experiences, who he meets, things like that. In the afterlife, there's one place where he's early on where he's learning his way around. Of course, one thing he'll tell you right quickly is that the power of intention is much greater in the afterlife. And so we create our clothes, we create our houses, and so that's why um, the levels in the afterlife are stratified, why people of different levels of consciousness find themselves in different zones in the afterlife, because the power of consciousness is so great. It's important to have people who are compatible with you in that level. If you have a psychopathic murderer in the same level with you, and whatever he thinks gets instantly materialized, you wouldn't be very happy. So it's important to sort of separate things. And that's what hell is really based on. Hell is that lowest level where the people with the lowest impulses are all together, and they find themselves butting heads and colliding with each other. Um, Nobody can really do any damage. Because their bodies are insubstantial, they can't really hurt each other, but they can certainly cause a lot of emotional fear and pain, and that's really what makes up that lowest level. Another great telepathic medium was Anthony Borgia, who acted in a similar biographical uh, function with Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson, whose father had been Archbishop of Canterbury. And that's called Life in the World Unseen. It seems that Benson was also educated in the church, and he wrote theology, but he was also somewhat psychic, and he had some experiences with spirits while alive, and he had reason to suspect that maybe the Episcopalian, the Church of England's their take on the afterlife wasn't quite right. But he never broke ranks while alive. He sort of wrote according to the company line, but he wanted to find out when he died what the truth was. And when he died, he began explaining to the medium, Anthony Borgia, what he encountered and what the truth was about the afterlife. And so his book is also a remarkable insight into what goes on when we pass over. So there are many, many different accounts of the afterlife. In my book, Science of the Soul, I try to take as many of these as I can from different points of view, not just the telepathic ones, but also the ones based on automatic writing, the ones based on electronic voice phenomena, the ones that come from near-death experiences, from out-of-body experiences. However, we have little insights and glimpses into the afterlife, and put those all together and compare them and see if there's a consistent picture that you come up with. And I found that there is, and so in chapter 12 of my book, I go through what the comparisons are for many different qualities and aspects of life in the afterlife. Because the power of intention is so great in the afterlife, it wasn't clear to me necessarily that there had to be a consistent picture. But if it's not, then you can't really believe any picture very, very far. You can't take it very far. But remarkably, the accounts are pretty consistent. So that was interesting to find out. So these accounts tell us about the conditions over there, what the rules of life are. It tells us that there are buildings, there are landscapes, there are organizations. It describes the nature of light, water, flowers. One thing that Benson talks about, for example, is that the flowers have colors that we don't see here on the earth. They have remarkably, amazingly beautiful colors. They seem that they have a life, a consciousness, an awareness, the flowers do, that we're not normally accustomed to here. Um, the buildings, we tend to create our own house uh, based on our own intentions. Um, there are libraries and other places to learn. There are laboratories for the scientifically inclined. They have fabulous laboratories. It's surprising. Uh, Robert Monroe of the Monroe Institute, was a scientist, and he worked with measuring brain waves, of course, at Hemisync here at the Monroe Institute when he was alive. But when he communicated back to his students and colleagues after he died, he was quite happy over there because he had his own laboratory there, and he could create a far better lab there than he ever could here. He could equip it fully with anything he could imagine. All he had to do was imagine it, and it would materialize. And for an experimentalist, that's heaven. um, and one of the things I also learned is that in these laboratories, they have a much more advanced science than we have here. They know a lot more about science than we do here. And sometimes they transmit it to various inventors. I know Thomas Edison tried to receive intuitive messages from the spirit world quite regularly. He had a regimen of sleeping 2 2-hour shifts a day. He wanted to be groggy. He wanted to be half asleep because that made him more attentive to dream information and to intuitive information. So he was looking for ideas. And what they say is that they will communicate them to us if they won't get misused, if we don't turn them into weapons. So some things they're able to transmit to us, others we're not ready for yet. Excuse me. One other aspect is that the water is universally described as having special properties in the afterlife. I saw this in 6 or 7 different examples where even though it looks like water that we see in our physical world, when you dive into it and swim and come back up and get out, you're not wet. It doesn't stick to us the same way that water does in the physical world. So the chemical bonding and some of the other the things that we're used to from material science don't quite happen the same way over there. So water has a different property. So this is just little glimpses. I have a lot of stories in my book where I go into more detail about what the character and the qualities are in the afterlife. But the next kind of medium that's important is a physical medium. They produce ectoplasm. It sort of exudes from their body when they go into trance. And it's a strange name, and it's a strange substance. It's not entirely physical. It's partially physical. You can see it, you can photograph it, you can feel it. But it appears as though about half of it is in the spirit world. Half of it has another kind of energy that's not physical. I believe that is a torsion energy. That's my supposition. When a medium typically starts producing this stuff in a trance state, it is sort of pulled out of them. It'll pile up on the floor, and then other spirits are able to get into that pile of ectoplasm and cover themselves with it and make themselves visible. They can also mold it and shape it into other objects, either as rods to lift or move physical things, or into a voice box for direct voice. This is a fairly rare ability, at least from what we see in the West today. There aren't too many people who naturally produce this. Um, the advantage is, though, that when it does happen, the results are quite striking. You can make permanent evidence, permanent proof. You can make plaster casts of this stuff. You can make voice recordings. You can photograph it. So it's quite powerful as a form of proof of the afterlife. One of the people who did research, this was more heavily researched about 80 or 90 years ago. It was the early part of the 20th century. This was the heyday of research for this subject. This man is a Nobel Prize winner, Charles Richet. He worked extensively with ectoplasm, trying to understand it because he knew how important it was. He says, when I recall the precautions that all of us have taken, not once, but 20, 100, even 1,000 times, it's inconceivable that we should have been deceived on all these occasions. Sometimes these ectoplasms can be seen in the process of organization. I have seen an almost rectilinear prolongation emerge from Eusapia Palladino's body, its termination acting like a living hand. Now, if that does not sound weird to you, so you see like this, a rod or something straight coming out of her body, stretching out, and then at the end of it, you see, 4 fingers and a thumb moving. There are all kinds of properties of this stuff that totally defy any facile, materialistic explanation. He says, I have been able to see the first lineaments of materializations as they were formed. A kind of liquid or pasty jelly emerges from the mouth or the breast of Martha, which organizes itself by degrees, acquiring the shape of a face or a limb. Under very good conditions of visibility, I have seen this paste spread on my knee and slowly take form so as to show the rudiment of the radius, the cubitus, or the metacarpal bone, whose increasing pressure I could feel on my knee. So this was in the day before they had good photography. Now this is a more recent photograph with infrared photography of Minnie Harrison, a well-known medium in South Africa. And I became acquainted with some of this work because of a physicist named Jan van der Zande, who had spent time in South Africa and had come across her home circle and some of the mediumship work she was doing. He was a conventionally oriented material scientist. He studies diamonds. He was over in South Africa to work with the diamond manufacturers, the diamond miners. And but if you're a material scientist and you're confronted with ectoplasm, you know you have a material that requires a real challenge to the present theory of physics, really. So he became quite an expert studying what goes on in these seances. And here's Johannesburg, another medium in South Africa. You can see it's coming from his nose. It just spreads out, covers his whole body. It often will pile up on the floor, and then the spirits will start using it to cover themselves, to take shape. Here's my theory, from what I know now, of how this might work. For one thing, we know that the scientists that worked in the early part of the 20th century would often clip off a little piece of the ectoplasm, put it in a container, and analyze it later in the lab to see what it is. And what they found is cells and fluids from the medium, or even sometimes from other people in the seance group, the sitters, And so it's like little tissue, basically, from humans, but they're little in a fragmented form, either as droplets of liquid or as fragments or flakes of skin, things like that. And that's what was left after the experiment was over. And that's all that was left. Those are pretty inanimate, pretty ordinary objects to find. What appears to be the secret is that something else gets added during the seance. And what I think gets added is torsion. I've described in my book, and in the second book and in this book, how torsion energy can twist. It's a twisting of space-time, and it can twist around itself and can even form sort of threads and strings of torsion that would give tensile strength and give binding to other objects that are trapped in it. For example, human tissue has DNA in it. So you have a little spiral already of molecules that are making a part of the tissue. So I think that probably the torsion energy wraps itself and entangles itself in the other tissue and makes sort of a glue that holds it all together and gives it the ability to move the way it moves. So put them all together, it would look like here are your cells or your normal physical objects that the experimenters find afterwards, the remains that are left when the thing's all over. But then what's missing, what's gone, is the torsion, these little threads of torsion that are holding it all together and give it a fibrous, almost a string-like quality. And that's one description that holds true, that people who work closely with ectoplasm, that it does have a stringy quality. It acts kind of like it's a bunch of threads. In fact, some people who have tried to fake ectoplasm will use muslin or some kind of crude cloth as a substitute. But that's what it looks like. And the other thing that spirits often do in a seance is they will turn this ectoplasm into a fabric, into a cloth which they'll cover themselves with as a robe, so they won't have to have so much of their skin exposed directly to the ectoplasm. But my hypothesis is that this is what ectoplasm is. And so if you're in the spirit world, you can still manipulate this stuff because you can manipulate the torsion filaments. If you're in the physical world, you won't see the torsion, but you see the cells. They will reflect light. Therefore, it'll photograph well. If you touch it, you can feel there's a substance there because it gives them a material property. So that's the idea anyway. So this model explains how ectoplasm can have a physical and a spiritual property. And it also is consistent with this fibrous or threaded nature often ascribed to ectoplasm. Now, Gillet is one of the pioneers of this research back in the 1920s. Ectoplasmic substance may assume the likeness of more or less visible filaments, giving the unaccustomed observer the impression of threads intended to move an object fraudulently. So this is why sometimes people think there's fraud there when it's not, because it looks kind of fakey, but because they're threads. At other times, it assumes the appearance of light woven stuff, like muslin, and photography shows the web. This has often been thought of as proof of fraud in cases of quite genuine metapsychic phenomena. And I got several of the books by people like Gillet, who who did this work, and there are some remarkable experiments that I'll probably be talking about in later installments. But one, well, I'm not sure if it'll come up in this set of slides or not. One type of experiment they did was to take a spirit who was working with them. The spirit is right there, and they have a medium who is communicating with the spirit, so they make sure that he's cooperating. And they'll make a special material, which involves, say, wax that's melted, lying on the surface of a bowl of water. And the temperature is kept just right so the wax stays soft. Then they'll ask the spirit to, they'll use the ectoplasm, cover him with ectoplasm, and then move his hand through the wax sheet. And the wax will then cover the ectoplasm with a glove, which is like a mold of the shape of his hand. And then they'll ask the spirit to now remove his spirit hand, and it leaves this delicate wax mold, this glove, intact. And in this way, they can get very accurate fingerprints and accurate moldings of physiological features from dead people who are quite alive in the spirit world, who are cooperating in this way. Not only do they do this, but they take a spirit, have a spirit maybe hold both hands together, clasp them together, twist them together, or have stick his whole face in. They'll get a mask of his face and make a permanent record of the physical shape of the being from the ectoplasm. So here's what Richer says: I shall not waste time in stating the absurdities, almost the impossibilities, from a psychophysiological point of view of this phenomenon. A living being or living matter formed under our eyes, because that's what it looks like. When the spirit gets into the ectoplasm, it looks like it's just kind of creating out of nothing. It's just the pile of ectoplasm rises up and takes the shape of a living being. It has the proper warmth, apparently a circulation of blood, a physiological respiration, and also a kind of psychic personality, having a will distinct from the will of the medium. In a word, a new human being. This is surely the climax of marvels. Nevertheless, it is a fact. And this again from the Nobel Prize winner, Charles Richer. And here's an example from the home circle of another spirit that is manifested. So what you're looking at here, there's a spirit who has come there, gone down into the pile of ectoplasm. Some part of it has been turned into a fabric, a woven fabric of this muslin-like material, and he covers himself with that. Then the parts that are to be the flesh, the face and the hands, they'll pat the ectoplasm onto that part of their surface, because what appears to be the case is that in the spirit world, we still have bodies, and that's kind of remarkable. Not that we're stuck with them. It's kind of our option whether we're going to be using them or not. But if they want to have a body in the spirit world, they can, and that pattern is the same one they had when they were here. So they can use that and then attach the ectoplasm to it to create these manifestations. The same thing occurs when people go into the afterlife, when they die, or make a visit there, and they will look for a loved one, for example, and they can recognize that person by his appearance. So we do have a shape that we carry with us, and it's always possible to adopt that shape if we want to, and that is useful here in materializing in ectoplasm or in the afterlife when you're trying to find someone. So that's an interesting observation that comes out of this stuff. Um, what they also say is that because all of this material, all of this white stuff is ectoplasm that has come from the medium, it takes energy to produce it. And at the end of the seance, it will go back to the medium. The spirit will leave out of that shape. He'll duck out. It'll collapse down to the floor, and then it'll start melting back, and it'll contract back into the medium. And that's remarkable to see. I mean, if you don't believe this stuff, and then you see that, you say, well, can't explain that any other easy way. And what they say is that the cloth muslin takes much less energy to produce because it's fibrous, which is the natural character of ectoplasm. And therefore, this takes less total energy. They just use only a small part of their surface area for covering by the skin of their hands and their face, so they're recognizable. And then the rest, they use the muslin to produce. So this is all very interesting stuff, and it all makes sense to me, at least. Here's another example that I think my friend Jan Vanderzandt had actually seen. This is from on Ag. She's one of the people in the home circle. The home circle in South Africa was run by Minnie Harrison, and on Ag was her older sister, I believe, had died about 4 years earlier, but would often materialize and show up in her seances. And that's her standing up there. That's on Ag. She's dead. Been dead about 4 years, but she would show up, and very lively. When you meet these beings, and they're covered in this way so we can perceive them, it makes it clear that they're still alive, that our life continues in the afterlife. They're just as vibrant, just as intelligent as they ever were. And I have a story here, an account of a woman who went to one of these seances that this was the picture you see on Ag there. This is a lady named Gwen Schlegel, who was about to go to the seance, her first time, never been before, and she was scared because she was going to be meeting dead people, and it scared her. And so she says, before the sitting started, I was terrified. But after it started, to my astonishment, into the room in a full red light came this little old lady. She was absolutely fantastic. She was jolly and friendly and full of fun. She came to each of us in turn and shook our hands and welcomed us. At that moment, all my fears left me. I saw her face clearly, very clearly. She was in like a little white shroud, the ectoplasm. Her face was a human face, lovely smile, laughing eyes. It was an old lady's hand I took hold of, warm, like meeting a living person. I just wish everyone knew this. After the old lady had gone, my mother's sister, Aunt Jane, came. This is another person in the seance who materializes next. She was amazing. She had been dead a couple of years, and this was her first time to materialize. She found it very difficult, unable to draw herself to her full height, but I clearly recognized her. All the time I had known her, she'd been deaf and dumb, but she was very excited tonight to be able to speak to her sister Phoebe by name. Everything could be clearly seen. I'll never forget it as long as I live. And I think most of us would probably say the same if we had that experience. But that gives a pretty good feeling for what one of these seminars is like. And it just also shows you the power of a physical medium, that when you can manifest ectoplasm and accomplish these things, there's nothing that is more convincing than that. And this is Gwen Schlegel. I just read that article. So in direct voice, is usually talked about as a separate kind of mediumship, but it again involves ectoplasm, but only as a voice box, only as a medium that makes it possible for the spirit to make a sound. So you don't actually see the spirit, but you can hear the voice. And if you, I'll show you a couple of pictures here of. Let me see if I have that. Here we go. You can see the little bag coming out of his nose and sitting on his shoulder, and that's ectoplasm. That was not there to start with. That just forms. He's not doing anything. He's just sitting there. There are spirits helping in the seance that you can't see that are involved with shaping the bag. And there's also spirits there who are lined up, whoever is going to be speaking. They put their face into it to make the sound. But the way it's done, it's their voice that is creating the sound. And therefore, it's their accent. They have to go to some trouble to sound like themselves, because after all, in the spirit world, they don't use their voices. So they have to kind of go with the mental process to remember what their voice used to sound like. And they have some recordings of what the coaching is like between the spirit workers, helping them to learn to speak direct voice the first time. But they do have unique knowledge. They remember details about their life that no one else would have. Often, we have many examples of spirits who are not native English speakers. They are from other languages, other countries, other cultures. And when they come across, it's very obvious that it's not the medium that's doing it, it's somebody else. There's also been lots of testing to be sure there's no trickery involved in this. The most famous, perhaps, is Leslie Flint, who worked for many decades in England. Here he is doing a direct voice. Here on his left shoulder is the little bag, little ectoplasm bag that's formed that makes the voice box. Lots and lots of experiments over many years done with him. Typical experiment here, we put into a rigid chair. They'll tie his legs down to the legs of the chair, tie his arms to the arms of the chair, fill his mouth with a pink liquid that they will measure precisely how much they're giving him, make him hold it in his mouth the entire session. Then tape his mouth closed with what they call elastoblast, a kind of a tape that makes it impossible for him to speak. And then have the seance. And even then, the voices come through just as they always have. There may be a dozen different voices that will speak, different times, different places, same amplitude as before. Even when they do this in buildings he's never been in, he's traveling around, maybe a new house or a new building. He's all by himself. There's no possibility for accomplices. And yet the same thing happens. There are all kinds of examples to show that the conventional explanations don't work, that this is something very special. The voices, for example, don't originate with him. They don't come out of his head or out of his mouth. They usually are originating a foot or two away from him. There was one case where, um, let's see, a boy who had been a soldier was coming through, and his mother had come to attend the seance, but she'd been late and had not gotten in before they closed the door. So she was locked outside of the seance room, and they didn't want to open the door. And so the origin of the voice moved across the room over to a place near the door and spoke from there for the rest of the session. And they could tell that it was trying to make sure that she could hear him. So Leslie Flint discovered his ability by accident. He noticed that when he was a young boy, he loved to go to the movies. But the people around him would get mad because they would hear voices in the dark. They would assume he was making the sounds. They'd start complaining, hitting the back of his chair, things like that. He would have to leave the theater because he wasn't doing anything, but the voices were talking around him. And that was his first clue something was amiss. Then he went to a spiritualist church because he was curious about it. And the voice came through from one of his teachers, a man who had already passed away. And the man was buried in a graveyard that he had actually been at that morning and had seen the gravestone and had cleared around it, cleared the weeds around it, and put some flowers there. And when he went to the church in the afternoon, the message came through from that man thanking him for putting the flowers around his gravestone. And the lady who ran the seance, or ran the meeting also, told him that he had real potential for direct voice. And he would often fall asleep during the church services. And while he was asleep, there would be voices coming out around him and giving messages. So the main thing is that they all come in their own voices, their own accents, and their own languages. We're lucky in the case of Leslie Flint because a couple began attending his sessions regularly with tape recorders and recording every session in the 1940s. And so now they have hundreds of sessions recorded, and they're available at the Leslie Flint Foundation website. And from these, we also learn a lot about the afterlife. In one of them, for example, the voice came through of a man who used to attend the seances there. It was Mr. Olson. He was kind of a friend of one of the men who did the recordings. And when his voice came across in this seance, he was bantering with the fellow, with his friend who was still alive, saying, man, I'm so happy over here. You know, you ought to hurry up and get over here and join me. And this one quote, he says, I wouldn't come back to the physical if you offered me all the gold in China. I'm perfectly well and perfectly happy, and I can't tell you how marvelous it is to be dead. So it definitely gives you a vivid perspective for what things look like from the other side. You can also learn, because there are hundreds and hundreds of recordings, when you start going over them, and I really would advise anyone to do this, because when you do, it'll change your life. You get a vivid appreciation that these spirits are still completely alive. Some of them are famous, like Mahatma Gandhi. There are ministers in England who were well known at the time when they passed over. Some came back and talked. Oscar Wilde came through, and a very, very funny couple of seances where he talks about what life is like on the other side. And but you also get a even clearer idea of what the various levels are like, what is like the transition between the different, well, death for one thing, what it's like to die, but then also to move through the various planes of existence. From direct voice communications, we learned a lot about the afterlife. For example, what it's like to die and to shift frequency as we move from one plane to another. And it verifies the synchronized universe model that I've based most of my work on. It's remarkable that their description of what it's like to die and to shift through different dimensions fits the model perfectly. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. In one of them, this is from a Leslie Flint seance. This is a man who just died, and he's looking back. It happened several years ago now, and he's talking to the Leslie Flint seance group, but he's describing what it was like when he died. He says, anyway, and then the doctor, he went, and then they came, that they took my body away, you see. They slumped it down like an old sack of potatoes, and I thought, I'm not going after them. I'm going to stay here in me home. I might as well sit down in me chair now that it's empty. So I sat down there and tried to think it all out. Because one thing you do learn is that we're not prepared for death. We're not told what to expect. And so when it actually happens, it's kind of a shock, and that's what happens with Mr. Biggs here. But so he says, anyway, my sister, by this time, she'd gone off, and I was alone in the house again. And all of a sudden, it was just as if the fireplace disappeared. It's the only way I can put it. And there, where the fireplace was, it was as if the wall had disappeared, and I could see beautiful green fields and trees, and a little sort of well. I was going to say it was a river. It was more like a little brook. So his whole house has just faded away, and he's seeing a landscape instead. So he's shifting phase. The frequencies that he's in are shifting away from the Earth frequencies now. So he's synchronized with a different set of frequencies where he's perceiving a different realm, a different place. And then Rupert Brooke also talks about this same experience from his perspective. Rupert Brooke, the famous poet who died in World War I, and also came through in several Flint seances. And he described, the sitters asked him what death was like for him, what happened to him. And he says, I don't even know how to describe it. It seemed as if I was in a body which no longer seemed at first to be the same. And yet in appearance, it was the same. I just couldn't understand it. I just didn't realize that I had died. So the frequency has already shifted some from the physical world frequency. So he's slightly out of phase now. And he's not really in contact like he was before. So something is different. But he's not fully shifted yet. So he says, everything in a sense seemed quite natural. And yet the body I was using seemed foreign to me. I don't feel it had any weight. And yet I was still on Earth. What annoyed and irritated me so terribly was I could see other people, and they could not see me. It all seemed so strange. I remember vividly sitting beside a river and looking at myself and not seeing myself. I could see no reflection. Here I was going around to various people that I had known, trying to tell them I was alive and well, and they just didn't realize I was there. I had to adjust myself to the fact that I had a body that was to all outward appearances the same, and yet obviously was not a real body from the point of view of the earth. So here he's already shifted part of the way, so he's um, probably seeing his astral double at this point, but he's clearly out of phase with the earth to some extent because they can't see him. And he doesn't know how to account for it and doesn't know why they can't see him. But he's still on the earth at this point. I heard myself saying, "What is this place?" And a voice seemed to answer, "This is a place where you can be brought into new being. Here the vibrations will make possible for you a new way of life. This is a cleansing station." I couldn't understand what was meant by a cleansing station. It seemed such an odd term. It seemed far from anything that one can imagine. There was a glorious sound and illumination and people. Gradually I began to realize there was a change coming over me. I could feel that the people around me were changing in some subtle way too. I couldn't explain it. It suddenly seemed as if my whole body was becoming suffused with some charged power, some vitality. Everything seemed to become much more solidified. Somehow, before, it all seemed so unreal. Gradually, it seemed to become much more real, more intense. So what it seems to be happening is that his frequency is now shifting to be compatible with the astral afterlife dimension. And now, because he's in phase with that, that now begins to seem real to him. The beings on that plane are becoming more real to him now, and the earth stuff is going away. So this is the cleansing station, means that you're washing away the earth energies and you're taking on the new energies in the next plane. And there's lots more about that. In my book, I go into more detail there, but the basic idea seems to be very consistent with the synchronized universe model. It's just like shifting the dial on a radio. You're tuning off of one channel onto a different channel. And as you do, the new channel becomes real. You can understand it, and it all seems alive, and the old one fades away. Another direct voice medium, George Valentine, who worked in New York, got some very strange voices coming in his seances. One of them sounded like an old Chinese man, and he was speaking some version of Chinese. No one in the group could understand it, and but they knew of a scholar named Dr. Huymant, which was quite a linguist. So they invited him to come to the next seance and see if he could make anything out of this strange voice. This is going to give you some idea of the kind of the quality of information that's available in direct voice. So Dr. Huymant, when he gets there, he meets the medium, Valentine. He's not too impressed. He says his speech was far from polished. He seemed to lack imagination. His interests were of a very commonplace order, and he seemed as much puzzled as proud of the queer happenings which appeared to have their center in him. He was almost untraveled and exhibited no desire to see or know anything in countries other than his own. Above all, he seemed always to be natural. It was as if he were incapable of any form of acting at all. And yet, when the seance began, the voice of an old Chinese man began speaking. And Wyman could understand what he was saying. The voice said, "Greeting, O son of learning, reader of strange books. This unworthy servant bows humbly before such excellence." Wyman recognized the language as that of the Chinese classics, edited by Confucius 2,500 years earlier. It was Chinese as dead as Sanskrit or Latin. It is not spoken colloquially today. Wyman thought, if this is a hoax, it is a particularly clever one, far beyond the scope of any Chinese expert living today. So then Wyman begins testing, because Wyman remembered the first lines of a few poems that Confucius had written. Many of these were poems that scholars didn't quite understand today. As Wyman began reciting the first line of a verse in question, the spirit interrupted him and finished the poem. The voice then explained the errors in copying that had occurred after his death that had led to the modern confusion. In one case, there was a poem that scholars had puzzled over for hundreds of years and did not understand. The voice took up the poem and recited it to the end, and then put a new construction on the verses that made it hang together for the first time. The voice explained that it was a psychic poem, which was a recognized type of Chinese literature of the period. For the first time, the poem made complete sense. But during Wyman's visits to the seances, he heard dozens of different voices, and because he was a very gifted linguist who spoke many dozens of languages, as diverse as Latvian, Basque, Chinese, dozens of European languages. Sometimes the voices spoke at once, and he would often converse with them, not just the Chinese, but the Latvian, the Basque. He could speak those, and he would have conversations with the voices. And eventually, I think he was convinced that this voice was Confucius, because who else would know what he knew? So in addition to the wide range of languages and voice tones and pitches, there is the fact that more than one voice was present at the same time, and the voices often seem to come from different parts of the room. And add to this the unique and often personal knowledge displayed by the various voices. The ability of the Chinese speaker to not only quote the obscure poem with the correct accent, even though Chinese linguists cannot do it, but to provide an explanation for the meaning of the poem that had escaped Chinese scholars. So you can see that direct voice is an extremely powerful way to learn about the afterlife. And I used a lot of that information in little data points and trying to add to what we know about each level and the different aspects of the afterlife. One more source of information is mediumship, automatic writing. Automatic writing, as you know, is when the spirit takes over the muscles in your arm or your hand, and it begins moving on its own and writing. And the spirit can write what it wants to write and thereby communicate the message. And two examples of that. One is the architect, Frederick Bly Bond, who had been given the assignment of the Glastonbury Cathedral that was destroyed by Henry VIII. And he was asked to try to locate the foundations of the old church. They were doing some reconstruction and some repairs. And I think they also wanted to find some of the outbuildings. There were rumors, for example, that that famous kings were buried around there, and they wanted to test that idea as well. So Bly Bond had a friend who was good with automatic writing, and he would help him, and he would just sit down and open up his mind and go into a relaxed state and let his pen move across the page and see what would come. And what began coming were messages in an ancient Latin. And it turned out, as the messages explained who they were monks who had lived and worked in Glastonbury during the time before its destruction. And they used the opportunity to draw, as you see here, the floor plan of the old cathedral. They did a lot more than that. They gave a lot of details that aren't indicated here. The man doing the automatic writing, John Allen Bartlett, got messages like this in Latin: Capella St. Edgar, Abbas Vir, Fecit Hanc Compellum St. Edgar. It goes on. It talks about the details of the politics and the activities that were present in the cathedral when it was active. And so as a result, they managed to succeed in their project in record time. In about a year and a half, they had managed to uncover the entire foundation and some of the key outbuildings. And the ministry that was in charge of having them do this was initially quite excited and quite happy that he was so successful at being able to reproduce all of this stuff, until he told them how he got his information. And once he let it slip that it was coming through automatic writing, then everybody got very uncomfortable and they quickly shut down the project. Another example, one of the greatest of all automatic writing experts, has been Chico Xavier, the medium from Brazil, who wrote over 400 books using automatic writing. So he would go into a trance state and spirits would talk through his pen, and typically he would have a helper to put pages, blank pages, under his hand. He was writing so fast, he needed to have somebody there to do that. The writing, the books are in different styles. They show erudition, they show great knowledge, and very specialized knowledge about things that Chico Xavier would have no direct knowledge of. There was no library where he lived. Certainly there was no internet. No way for him to have the knowledge that is reflected in the wide number of books he wrote, which each one was signed by the name of the spirit who had actually written the book. And they find that the styles of those books do correspond to what those men in life had when they wrote. So it's a remarkable collection. One of the most famous of the books is called No Solar, which describes a special region in the afterlife in South America that was constructed by spirits from that area as a way station to help people who had recently died, to help them to adjust to the afterlife. And gives us a lot more information about what the afterlife is like. This came from a doctor known as Dr. Andre, who historically, I don't know if we have any records of him historically, but he was the one who began coming through Chico Xavier's writing, and I think there are like 7 books written based on his accounts. He was an atheist during his life, medical doctor, didn't believe in the afterlife. But when he died, he found himself in hell. He found himself in a cold, dark place with beings who were angry and unhappy, and a lot of fighting, very unpleasant, and took him a long time to figure out what to do. I think eventually he began praying, even though he was not a praying man, but didn't know what else to do. And his mother, who was religious, I think had prayed for him, and her prayers had a big effect in helping him get rescued. So eventually some spirit workers, we would call them angels maybe, came down and helped him to get to the next level. A very good documentary, little movie called Astral City, based on this book. These are some images of what it was like at the lowest level. Very dark and dreary. These figures often are fighting, often angry, often attack each other. No one can actually get hurt because it's not really material, but their anger makes it unpleasant to be there. Eventually he gets rescued and taken out of this lowest level to a region called Nasolar, which is sort of a way station to a better level. And this is just an illustration of what goes on in this. Once you get into Nasolar, you start to see a familiar feature that's described in many of the afterlife accounts. There are buildings, there are structures, there are, even though it's a creation of our consciousness, it's a creation of group consciousness. It's a creation that has a purpose and a function to it, and the function really is to educate us and to help us to grow and to learn. So the structures are designed to help us learn. So just like any other large city or large educational institution, different places specialize in different parts of that. Here Dr. Andre is lying in the bed. This is in Nasolar, and he's being worked on by a physician. Now he's dead, of course. This is his spirit body, but it has a lot of wounds that are emotional wounds, and also due to the abuse he put himself through from poor health, poor diet, poor practices when alive, and his emotional, energetic patterns. And so the doctor's working on him with energy medicine, something that looks a little bit like Reiki. And once the doctor begins reviving a little bit, he says, well, I'm a doctor, so let me help you out here. And they try to very nicely explain to him that he doesn't know how to do this stuff. He's never had any training in energy medicine, but eventually he comes around and he does learn to fit in, and he learns that advancing in the afterlife does require him to help, that the more he contributes, the faster he will be able to move to better levels. It's just one more view of some of the buildings that are described in this particular account of the afterlife. And here's an overhead view of part of the city, which they call an astral city. And it's interesting when you compare his account with people like Reverend A.H. Matson, who went into the afterlife, and he was in one of the middle astral levels too, and he describes buildings that have a very similar appearance. When Daniel Brinkley was dead in his near-death experience, he describes seeing crystal cities. And they really have a character that's very similar to some of the things that are depicted here. So I think that there's a lot of overlap. I think one thing that we can see from near-death experiences is that it depends on what level you go to in the afterlife as far as what your account, how you would describe what it was like. Some people have very negative, very frightening near-death experiences. They come back. About 1 out of 7, according to PMH Atwater, is negative. And so there happen to be 7 levels in the afterlife, and one of them is hell. So you can see maybe 1 out of 7 is about right. It depends on which level you end up at as far as what your experience was. But a lot of these accounts are remarkably consistent. There's water, there are concerts, there is recreation, all kinds of pleasant things, singing, music. Here is computers for accessing information when they can get communication from their family. They can check on their next lifetime and start planning for that. All kinds of activities that you can imagine would be important go on here. There's a concert happening in Nassau, and here he's working on visiting his family. One of the things that I talked about before, I think, is that there's a place where he does go back to visit and look in on his children after he's died. And he has some special guidance when he does that. But when he does that, he kind of goes back in the form of a little sphere. He's in like a little soap bubble. And he is able to zip into the house where the children live and to flit around and to watch them and listen to them. And these sound like orbs. These sound very much like the same kind of orbs that people see in photographs. So now I've got accounts of orbs from many different perspectives. Here is his mother, who's in the afterlife in a higher level, interacting with him. And so I'll just conclude this whole thing by saying that the effective consciousness is not limited by space or time. Higher dimensions are real. We can interact with them. The power of visualization and meditation can alter physical reality. As Bob Monroe said, through prayer, meditation, and visualization, we can create the world we want. As Victor Hugo said, all the armies of the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And I think it's time for our world to begin realizing that these higher planes and the soul are very real, and they're very much a part of who we really are. So with that, I'll conclude this part of the talk, and we can do questions.
In the Spiritist centers, there are Spiritist centers that do physical mediumship. However, it's considered a somewhat lower level of mediumship. Did you come across that information?
I didn't. I wasn't looking for it either. I did talk to somebody who, as I mentioned to you, had been down at John of God in January of this last year, most recently, and was talking about experiencing current when he was not present and could still feel the current. And I think what it impressed on me is that, I mean, that current that I felt also when I was there, but I didn't know much about it then. But it seems to be the same kind of current that mediums like direct voice mediums use. I mean, like Leslie Flint. I mean, they have a seance. They have sitters. They sit in a circle or something, and the energy of the sitters is all being kind of exchanged and goes into supporting the medium. So, in that sense, the energy that becomes the ectoplasm is very close to the energy in the current, which I never thought of that before. I don't know what I can do with that, but it seems like it's a step in the right direction anyway.
Yeah, what I was referring to is like manifestation, where they actually manifest objects, like you can manifest a vase of flowers.
Yeah.
And you can pick it up and it feels very substantial and real.
Yeah.
But in most cases, it kind of disintegrates after a few hours.
There's ectoplasm that is making the flowers.
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes they manifest things that evidently do last indefinitely. Like in Brasilia, if you go in the Temple of Goodwill, did you go in there?
I might have. We went to some big temple.
Yeah. It's a pyramid.
Yeah, I think so.
A big spiral labyrinth.
Yeah, I think so. We did that.
Okay, and there were some cases, that were glass. Were displaying some jewelry, some gemstones, and it said that they had been manifested by some medium.
Wow.
And that they had not disintegrated. They were there for years.
I just saw a message from someone asking how long the ectoplasm lasts, and I think the answer there seems to be that it really depends on the medium. The medium would have a finite amount of energy. They'll start getting tired toward the end, so they'll typically want to withdraw the ectoplasm back into their body before they get too tired, before they collapse. So I think that would be the limiting factor. I mean, I gather it's probably a half hour to a couple of hours, maybe. It depends on the strength of the medium, I would think. But if the gemstones are an example, then maybe there are ways of making it last longer. The other part of it that I don't know the answer to, with the Skoll project and other people who've done experiments also, but that particular one, when they're setting things up in their little their special room to have their phenomena, they're getting teleports, they're getting apports. They have objects that just drop out of the sky. And there, my impression is it's probably not ectoplasm, it's teleported from somewhere else. But does anybody know what the connection is or how that's done?
How it's done, I don't know. I know that in China, according to your first book,
Yeah,
Synchronized
yeah,
Universe,
yeah,
in China, they've done quite a bit of experimentation with that.
yeah. That the human consciousness is able to cause it to happen if you have the right level of consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. So it automatically returns to its own on its own to the medium. That's my understanding that typically the medium will pull it back into their body at the end of the session or before the end of the session, and that's kind of important to maintain the health of the medium. There have been cases where unscrupulous people turn bright lights on suddenly,
Hmm.
and that destroys the ectoplasm, and that causes a severe damage to the medium.
Hmm.
Um, when you want to take a sample to analyze, you have to ask the medium if you can clip off a sample before they retract it. Um, so clearly their own life force energy is probably wrapped up in that ectoplasm.
There's a question from Lurana Howard.
Okay.
He asks, I heard that touching ectoplasm would shock the medium. Any comment?
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that. Um, that's if another person shocks the medium, another person touches the ectoplasm.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
it.
I haven't seen that, but the ectoplasm is sort of a part of the medium, so I can see how it might be possible. Uh, Certainly, if someone did it in a abrupt or rough way, I can see they'd probably feel that. That could be very damaging, I would imagine. I mean, if bright light can do it, then grabbing it could also do it, I guess.
Um, let's see, we might be done. Anybody typing away?
Now, in the Q&A, I have a red one.
There's one, the one I just read.
That's the one you read, okay. And chat, we have four. Those are ones you also.
One of the things that Chico Xavier used to do, which I'm sure you know, but I'll just mention it since it wasn't part of the presentation, he would get letters from spirits to their loved ones, and they were often written in the handwriting of the deceased person.
Wow.
And and he would have these gatherings where people would come together in hopes of getting a letter. You
Now,
know,
does he know who was writing these letters? He wasn't writing.
well, he was channeling them. It was Chico Xavier. He was doing automatic writing.
His hand would do the actual writing.
Yes, yes. He would sit there like this with his
Yeah,
eyes closed, and his hand would be going, here,
yeah, yeah.
and um, and he would get these letters, and he would come to the gathering with a stack of letters, and he didn't know who these people were.
Uh-huh.
They were very specific, like they would name names,
Yeah,
Aunt Rose, that I'm sorry I broke her vase or whatever.
yeah.
Um, and then it would be signed, and he would just read the letter, and then the person, the loved one, would come up and get it, and it was very emotional. You can
Yeah,
imagine.
I can imagine. So did you
And
go to one of those? Did you ever?
did I ever go to one of those? No, I never met Chico Xavier.
Okay.
He lived in Minas Gerais, and I never went there.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I wish I had.
Well,
But
I know. I was told that he helped design the casa, or he picked the siting for it, or something.
mm,
No, God's casa was, has something.
And you know, all those more than 400 books that he channeled, all that money went to charity. He never kept a penny of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he was put on a national postage stamp, right?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think I saw that.
yeah,
He was very loved
yeah.
by the Brazilian people and people all over the world. And his guide, Emmanuel, um, made an announcement through Chico saying that knowing how people would grieve when he passed,
Hmm.
Emmanuel said he will pass on a day of joyous celebration in Brazil to counteract the sadness of
Oh,
and and the day he died was the day that Brazil won its fifth World Cup in soccer. And so the Brazilians were out of their minds with joy, and that was the day that he passed. 2002. I have met people who met him and went and watched him work.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it was very beautiful work he did. Let's see if there's anything else. I don't see anything else. No more questions, no more chats. And it's getting to be close to 9 o'clock, so maybe we should end here. And by the way, in addition to the movie that you were talking about, Astral City,
Yeah.
there's also a wonderful biography of Chico. Have you seen that movie?
I don't know. I might have. I'm not sure. I don't.
You can see it on YouTube. We showed it. We showed it several times at the center,
Uh-huh.
and it's a really powerful and I think, very well made
Hmm.
about his life. And it's not a documentary; it's acted out.
Uh-huh.
At the end, they show the real Chico, and in some news
Yeah.
release or video. But it's very well done, and it's very moving.
Hmm.
He was even as a child. His mother died when he was 4 or 5 years old. I think 4, and maybe 5. And he there were 13 or 14 brothers and sisters in his family.
Wow.
And the father couldn't care for them all when the mother died. And so he kind of, spread them around to relatives, to various different relatives. And he went to live with his godmother, who was quite abusive to him. And his mother would come and visit him. And whenever he was particularly sad or upset over something she would do, or the godmother would do, his mother would appear to him and comfort him and tell him, you've got to be strong. This will all be over,
Hmm.
So even from childhood, he was, like Edgar Casey.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So anyway,
Amazing.
it's a subject that I could go on and on about. And so I'll force myself to stop. And thank you so much. That was a beautiful presentation, Claude.
Thank you so much, Gloria.
And thank you, everyone,
Yeah.
for participating and for attending. And we didn't pick a date yet for the next one, but it'll be sometime in October on a Wednesday evening from 7 to 9. And I'm not sure of the subject. What is that next chapter? Is it EVP?
Probably so. That sounds right.
Okay, well, we'll announce it. If you're on our email list, you'll get the flyer. And if you're not on our email list, get on our email list so that you know when the next one is coming. Okay, well, thank you so much, Claude.
Great.
See you
Thanks,
next month.
Good night, everyone.
Take care.